Well, help me find a place here. Where do we get up to last week? We did Tefillah be'etzba, and we spoke about Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Pigul b'chol amater, I think we got up to. That's on page Chaf Beis. Can you either confirm or deny that? On the left column on Chaf Beis, Pigul b'chol amater, yeah? All right. So I don't have Chaf Gimel. You have Chaf Gimel? Or the original? You have only one copy, or you have an extra copy? No. Just bring me the original, and then I don't want to bother you with the machine. Okay. So we have something called Kol Amati. Now we're still talking about Pigul, and the flip side of Kol Amati is called Chatzi Mati. Excellent. Maybe after the shir, maybe we'll have time to. Okay. You know, I tried to make copies myself, but I tried with machine. In any event, fine. So, what's a case of Chatzi Mati? Let's say, for example, I think we may have touched on this, I don't remember. If you have shchita of shnei simonim, but you have to cut the kana and the veshet. And the Gemara wants to know what happens if he has a machshavas pigul for one of the simonim, but not for the other simonim. And that's called chatzi matir, because the shechita cannot be matir unless he shechts both simonim. So normally, in the case of zrika, for example, that's considered kol matir because all you need is one zrika. Although lechatchila maybe you have to do a number of zrikos on 4 sides or shtaim shein achas, whatever it might be, but one zrika is the barest minimum, and it is critical. So once you had a machshavas pigul on one zrika, that's called kol amat. And he mentions the case of shlomim. So let's say, for example, the matir of zrika in shlomim is vizvi haktoras ha'emurim, and kol amatir means the zrika. So once you did a single zrika, then you could be maktir the emurim. But if at the time of the shechita he had a machshavas pigul only with regard to one simon, that's called chishay b'chatzi matir. So one of the two simonim, whether it was the kana and the veshet, he had a machshava. Even though when I think about this case, it's hard to imagine the reality because, how many seconds pass between the shechita of one simon and the other simon? It's almost instantaneous. And I think this may be the last thing that we discussed last week. The case of menachos, we have ktores and komets. So that's number one. We take the kohen does the kmitza, and the shirayim of the kmitza are burnt on the mizbeach. But he also needs what's called haktoras halevona. And only when he has both kmitza and haktoras halevona, only then is there a heter on the shirayim, what's ever left after kmitza. So you now have two matirim, one is kmitza and the other is levona. If let's say at a machshavas chutz l'zmano or chutz l'mkomo on one of the two, it would not qualify as pigul. Now here we have another issue, which is not addressed by the sugya, but rather by the Rishonim. Very often we've distinguished between pigul and psul. You can have a carbon that's not pigul, but it's pasul. And the Rishonim want to know, in the case of a chatzi matir, although it's not pigul, which means an isakaris if you eat it, but would that machshava be sufficient to pasul the carbon? And here in Tov Lamed Beis, he claims that there's a Tosas Shita that although a Chatzi Matir is not a Machshava Poselis at all, in other words, not only is it insufficient for a Pigul, it's not even sufficient for a Psul, that's only on a Doraisa level. But on a Drabanan level, the carbon is possible. So nechleku rishonim, machshava b'chatzi matir ima carbon possible b'doraisa. Tosas' sheet is going to be that no, it's not possible doraisa, but Tosas admits that it's possible midrabban. And here we again, this is more for our Gemara Yivamis, which is Yesh Koch Biad Chacham Lakar Dov Min Torah. Can the Rabbanan create a psul of a carbon that the Torah doesn't recognize? On a Doraisa level, the carbon is kosher, the Rabbanan passel the carbon. And that's going to force the Bailan to replace the carbon because they were not Yotze, they didn't fulfill their obligation with the first carbon because the Rabbanan disqualified the first carbon. That's a big problem because if you hold ein koach biad chachamim lakar dov min Torah, how can they force him to bring a second carbon, which according to the Doraisa law is chulin? It doesn't even have the status of kodshim. I'm just pointing out a problem. Now let's talk about holacha. If the distance between the Kabbalah Saddam and the Mizbeach is more than one psia, more than one step, he's got to take multiple psios in order to fulfill his obligation as a kohen for holacha. What happens if he has a machshavas pigul on one of those steps, not on the entire process of holacha? It will generate pigul. Why? Why isn't that a case of chatzi matir? I mean, what good is psia achas if he hasn't yet gotten to the mizbeach? The afal gav shu tzorach laharbos b'psios k'dei lagia lemizbeach ein ze nechshav kechatzi matir mishum she'ein shir laholacha. So we're not going to look at the carbon itself and decide whether that psia is a matir on the carbon, because to be matir on the carbon, you have to have reached the mizbeach, and he hasn't reached the mizbeach. But rather, we're going to talk about holacha as an abstract concept, the avoda of holacha. Would there be an avoda of holacha in one psia, and he hasn't yet reached the mizbeach? And the answer is yes. Because when you're talking about the avoda of holacha as an abstract category, we're no longer concerned with the reality of any particular scenario. If I can show you one scenario in which the holacha was achieved with a single psia, for example, if let's say the shochet took the animal and brought him close to the mizbeach, it's one step from the makom shchita to the mizbeach, then holacha would only require one psia. There's no shir in psia, in holacha. It all depends on the reality. It could go from 100 psios to 0 psios, standing right next to the mizbeach. So a definition of holacha as an avoda in abstract terms, doesn't have a shear, and one psia will qualify, and you can check the box of halacha. And that's a chumrah because it means that there's machshavas pigul even during one psia, because that's considered a full mati. Now, at what moment in time is pigul chal? You and I might have said at the very moment that he had a machshava of chutzes mano, chutzim komo, that already engenders the chal Hashem pigul, but that's not true. Pigul, Torah's pigul ochala al habasar elali achar shekarvu matire akarban behechshe. We're going to look at the hakrava as an entire enterprise, an entire constellation made up of many little different segments. And the ultimate process or avoda that completes the karban is going to be when the karban itself will be kosher, meaning the complete mitzvah of hakrav. Again, it won't be kosher because he had a machshavas pigul, but let's bracket the machshavas pigul. Let's imagine he didn't have a machshavas pigul. When, at what moment in time would the karban be perfect, would be complete? So let's say at the time of the shechita, he had a machshava to eat the basar, be back to the imum chutzes mano chutzim koma. That generates pigul. But when will the pigul be chal in the basar? That's only after zrikas hadam. So you have shechita, and then kabbalas hadam, then olachas hadam, and then finally zrikas hadam. Only with zrikas hadam is the matir of shechita complete. The matir of shechita is meant to set up a zrika. With the zrika, which is the final avoda, which is absolutely le'ikuva, it's an absolute must, then at that point, pigul would be chal, but not before. So if a person were to eat from the basar hakarban, when the kohen had a machsheves chutzes mano at the moment of shechita, and before the kohen was zorik the dam, somebody ate the basar of the karban, he would not be chayav kares, because the moment of the chalos pigul in the basar is delayed, is suspended until the last avoda, which in this case is zrika. Therefore, gak liachar zrika chal toras pigul ala basar. And this, I hate to use Aristotelian terminology, but Aristotle was famous for his distinction between potential and actual. So at the moment of shechita, when he had in mind chutzes mano, he created a potential Torah pigul. But that potential will only be upgraded, will only be transformed to an actual Torah pigul after zrika. Between the shechita when he had the machshav and the zrika, it's only potential. It becomes actual after the zrika. Now, if you recall, we had a machlokes rishonim about a chatzi mati. Let's say one siman of two simanim of shechita, he had a machshav chutzes mano. Would that be enough to passel the karban? It's not enough for pigul. And here we can ask the same question, and we're going to find the same machlokes rishonim with regard to the status of the karban before zrika. So we had a machshavas pigul at shechita. We said that the Torah's pigul is not chal; it's only there in potential. would the korban be possible at least at that time? Achronim istapku im gam psul hapigul eino chal, meaning it's suspended and delayed el liachar zrika. Oh, Dilma, perhaps. Psul hapigul chal miyad. The moment he did an avoda with a machsheves pigul, it's pigul. So now we have a problem, because the sugya establishes that pigul needs hakrovas hamatirim. How can you tell me, right? So, for example, if someone eats basar pigul, he's chayav kares. That's only after the hakrova was complete. He says the following: as far as a chiv kares for eating pigul, that will only go into effect after the hakrova is complete. But as far as the psul karban is concerned, the psul karban will be chal already after zrika. So you can have two different people, we'll call them Reuven and Shimon, both eating from a karban in which the Kohen, at the time of the Shechita, had a machshava chutz zman. Reuven ate the basar before the zrika. Shimon ate the basar after the zrika. Shimon will be chayav kares, and Reuven will not be chayav kares. But even so, the korban is possible. Now, we said that pigul is a piece of a puzzle, of an entire constellation, where every piece of the puzzle fits in, and every segment of the hakrava was done kidas ukidin behechsher, except for one machsheves pigul. Everything else was done perfectly. However, nifsal hakarban mishum psul acher. Imagine if at the time of the shechita he had a machsheves chutz zman, but in the meantime, some point after shechita, the karban became tameh, and he hasn't yet completed the avodas hakarban. Paradoxically, in such a case, there's no machsheves pigul, because since the psul was chal in the karban, there's no pigul, because pigul requires that every other piece of the puzzle was done, was implemented kidas ukidin. Now, here's a fascinating question, which is addressed by the sugya in Zvachim Chav. What happens if at the point of zrika, at the point of shechita, he had a machsheves chutz zman? That's a machsheves pigul. Then when he got to the zrika, he had another machsheves pigul, but not chutz zmano, but rather chutz l'mkomo. Again, if you would analyze this question from intuitive human rational logic, you would say, Kal v'chomer that it's pigul. He doubled up his problem. He had a machshavas pigul chutzes mano at the beginning of his avoda and a machshavas chutzes komo at the end of his avoda. My gosh, it should be pigul times 2. It's not pigul. Because the first machshavas pigul creates the inherent potential for pigul, but only if there's no psul in the karma. When he got to the zrika and he had a machshava of chutzim komo, let's say, for example, so he started with chutzim mano, he ends with chutzim komo, the machshava of chutzim komo in zrika passes the karma. And we said that machshavas pigul only generates pigul if that one specific piece of the puzzle was a machshava amafagelas. All the other pieces of the puzzle and any other aspect that I mentioned, the avodah was done kidasu kidin. But here in this case, after the machshavas pigul of shchita, he messed up during the zrika. Now, if again he repeats in zrika the same identical machshavas pigul, meaning both in shchita and in zrika he had a machshav of chutzes mano, that's for sure pigul. That's pigul times 2, because then he's just adding to the pigul and reiterating the pigul. But if, on the other hand, he had a different machshavas pigul, from chutzim komo, he went to chutzim mano, or vice versa, then what he does is with the second machshava, he passes the carbon, and he makes it impossible for the machshavas pigul to be mefagelos. Now he asks a kasha. B'chol carbon shechashvu bo machshavas pigul nifsal carbon. In other words, machshavas pigul has 2 repercussions. Number 1, it generates pigul in the chefts of the basar. That's a chiv kares if you eat it. And number 2, it passes the carbon. Now, if that be the case, if he had a machshavas chutzes mano or chutzim komo during shchita, then the zrika should passel the carbon. I'm not so bothered by this kasha, but let me try to explain what bothers him. Pigul, machshavas pigul has 2 parts to it. Included in machshavas pigul is a psul karma. In that sense, you could never have pigul. Why? Because we said that pigul means that in every other dimension, the carbon is kosher, but that can't be so. Because by definition, when he had the machshavas pigul, he generates a psul in the karma. If he generates a psul in the karma, that undermines and torpedoes the whole enterprise of pigul. You follow the question? You can never have pigul. You virtually have reduced pigul to a non-set, a null set. Let's read it again. Nifsal carbon, which in a sense undermines the entire process of pigul. So imagine he had a machshavas chutzes mano chutzim komo during shchita, then the zrika itself is possible. Why? Because we wait until zrika, until the psul carbon is chal, but then the zrika is not behechshen. He can have the most religious and virtuous machshavas and intentions during the zrika, but nevertheless, it's possible. The zrika is psula, because the entire carbon became possible through the machshavas chutzim komo pigul during the shchita. Im kein arei ein kan zrika kshera. Kidei lahachil psul pigul. You've undermined the entire enterprise of people. Torah shezrikas pigul arehi maratza lepigula. Vehu shazrika nechsheves kikshera linyan zeh shimachshira es hakorban kidei sheyachul bo psul pigul. Usually we use the word ritzui carbon to mean that the carbon is kosher. But the word ritzui really means to set up the carbon and change its status, which could either be kosher or could be possible. And now we're saying maratza lepigula. I mean, this is a different kind of ritzui. This is a ritzui that sets up pigul, which is the most severe of all psule carbon. Not only does it pass the carbon, but it generates a chi of karis v'achilas habos. The Torah says that zrika is maratza lepigula. Wow. We're going to consider the zrika as if it was a zrika kshera in order that the machsheves chutzizmano could generate a psula pigula. And that's called, in the language of the Gemara in Tzvachim, maratza lepigula. Okay, let's just make a note of where we got up to. What is tomorrow? I know it's Monday, but Rosh Hashanah. That's right.